Welcome, everybody. This is the Liberty Classroom class, History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution. I'm your instructor, Robert Murphy. And in this introductory lecture, I just want to give you an introduction to the course, tell you what's going to be in part 1 versus part 2, and just explain to you my philosophy, if you will, or the way I'm going to approach this particular class, just so you have some idea of what you're in store for. So here we see the outline of my lecture during this particular class, and I'm going to be doing this for all the courses, all the classes that I teach. I will give you an outline up front so you can get an idea of what you're going to cover during that particular lecture. Okay, so course plan, let me just outline the big picture here. First of all, what are my goals in this course? What do I hope to get out of it? Maybe that'll give you a sense of what you might get out of it as well. So first of all, I want to make it fun for you. I realize that the history of economic thought, although it's very important, I would suggest, nonetheless, this could possibly be a dry subject for some of you, and so I want to make sure that you're really tuned in and you're anxious to read the next material and to tune in for the next lecture. So that's really what I'm going to be striving for. So on that note, let me just take a brief digression here and mention that in some of the Liberty Classroom courses, you have the instructor's video image. We decided for this class that it would just be a lot easier, and especially in recognition of the fact that many people listen to this while they're commuting, that we'll just go ahead and try to keep everything without the distracting professor's head floating in the sideline there. But for those of you who you're really just dying to know what does the instructor look like, well, here, let me just go ahead and show you. That's me right there. Okay, no, that's not. It's George Costanza from Seinfeld, for those of you too young to get the reference, but apparently there is some resemblance. Okay, back to serious stuff now that I've woken you up. What is it that I want to accomplish in this course? What's my philosophy going to be? Well, I want to make sure that you get a healthy sample of original source material. So what I mean by that is I want to make sure that you read these authors or these economists in the original. Obviously, if they didn't write in English, we're going to use a translation. But my point is, I think I would be doing you a disservice if I merely tried to paraphrase what it was that these thinkers from long ago said or believed. And that's just, for one thing, just to guard against my own possible biases. But even beyond that, it's part of the point of studying the history of economic thought is to see how was it that people long ago thought about these matters. And so you really have to be careful that you don't impose your own framework or methodology upon them. And you'll see that with lots of examples. There's also a tendency to try to give a very compelling and convenient history of economic thought to say, oh, people in the past believed such and such, but then they realize later on that such and such, and so we see how this new understanding, and the way to make that story really compelling, to make it appear as if there's this constant stream of progress, is to make the people in the past complete idiots, right? And then you attribute to them fallacies and ways of thinking or very crude propositions, and then from our modern vantage point, oh, look at how foolish they were, and here's the correct way to think about it. Well, again, that's usually not the way things actually happen. So let me just give you one example, which we'll come back to when we are covering the material in question. But I'm going to give you an example just so you know the kind of thing I'm going to really strive to avoid in this particular course. And so it concerns what's called the paradox of value. And the idea is, or you'll hear a caricature sometimes presented like this, that, oh, the classical economists couldn't explain why water, which was necessary for life, had such low market value, whereas something like diamonds, which of course are really just a luxury item, they really don't do too much for us that's really considered crucial in the grand scheme of things, but yet diamonds, even though they're not very useful in some respect, nonetheless command a very high market price, right? So that seemed to be a paradox of value. If you thought the market value of goods and services should have something to do with their underlying usefulness, or dare I say utility, to people, then it seems odd that water is so cheap in terms of market value, while diamonds are so expensive, right? And so sometimes, and I'm sure I'm guilty of this as well, when you're trying to explain this concept and the progression of how economists solve these problems to, let's say, an undergrad class, sometimes you engage in caricature. And so you say, oh, yeah, the classical economists, they were utterly clueless when it came to this phenomenon, but now, armed with the modern subjective theory of value, and in particular the concept of marginal utility that was developed in the early 1870s, now we can easily explain this apparent paradox. Haha, there you go, progress. But the point, or the problem is, with that story, is that obviously guys like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the quintessential classical economists that we'll be studying, it wasn't like they were befuddled. And if you said to them, "Hey, did you know that water is cheaper than diamonds?" that they would be surprised by that, or they would be flustered by it. They were fully aware of the situation. It was just, uh, the value system they used. It was awkward to explain that particular fact, and so they would have to deviate from what their model, if you will, would say, or they'd have to have exceptions to it. All right, but again, sometimes people take that very correct statement and then go a little bit too far and a bit sloppy, and will say things like Adam Smith believed in such and such, when no, he didn't actually believe that, right? He wasn't an idiot. All right, so that's the kind of thing I mean, where we're really going to strive to not just attribute like certain views to previous thinkers to allow us then to refute them and show how smart we are in our time. That rather, we're going to try to let you read a lot of these pieces in the original. And where possible, I'm going to try to, if there's something famous in these circles, I'll try to dig up the actual source material where that thing is discussed. So, for example, you probably heard of Say's Law. So we're going to go read that in the original context to see how did J.B. Say actually develop what's now called Say's Law. And we'll see that it's not what you've been taught as Say's Law, for one thing. And then also when you read it in context, I think you'll probably agree that it's pretty straightforward. And there shouldn't be much controversial about it. It's a fairly simple point that has now been just stretched into two different fashions for partisans on both sides of a controversy. The other element of it, too, is just I feel like you'll get a better sense of particular writers' personality and approach if we read in the original. So again, to summarize point number 2 here, I think it's going to be very important for you to read these economists in the original material, and without at times me imposing any preconceptions on it. So that's really what I also want you to get out of this, is just to have a nice sampling. Now, what else am I going to do? Just so there's no surprises coming into this course. I am going to focus on teaching you economics that when you walk away from this course, you will have learned a lot of economic theory. And so the mechanism that we're going to use, of course, is to go through and sample from pioneers or giants along the way for these issues that we're going to try to cover. But because of that, I feel that my comparative advantage here, what I should do is focus on those areas where I have relative expertise. All right, and we'll see that as the course progresses. So I want to reassure you, this isn't a project of vanity. The reason I'm doing this is because I think by focusing on these areas, I can give you something that you would not get from another history of economic thought class, right? So I want there to be some idiosyncrasy here, where if I focus on the things that I know best, this is a good vehicle for me to use to try to get those insights out. And we're going to see this is going to be areas where when I focus on things that I have a subtle point to make, it will always be for the purpose of teaching you a deeper understanding of the economic issue that's under dispute. And as I say, the last goal here is that when you walk away, you guys really have a command of basically all of economic theory. And we'll see when I cover the specific topics here in the next slide, just how ambitious this is going to be in some respects, right? So it's earlier in the treatment. It's going to be some things that we're going to have to move through quickly. So I'm not trying to say that you're going to have the definitive treatment of the history of economic thought per se. What I am saying is that when you walk away, you will have learned a heck of a lot of economics. And in particular, I'm going to hit those areas that I know best. And so I know that I can teach you some subtleties. Okay, so let's give an outline of the topics that we're going to be covering in this course. And again, it's a two-part course. So the first distinction then to make is, well, what's covered in part one and what's covered in part two. So part one, I am giving it the subtitle of Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution, whereas part two, I think we can aptly summarize as calling it 20th Century Economics. And to further elaborate, the topics in part one, now this isn't exhaustive, but these are going to be some of the major themes we're going to hit over and over as we go through these individual topics. We're going to stress free trade versus mercantilism. All right, so that's pretty straightforward, but just in case you're not sure what those terms mean, we're going to focus on, in my mind, the biggest contribution from the classical economists, people like Adam Smith in particular, was their development of the doctrine of free trade. And in particular, pointing out the flaws with what's called mercantilism. Now, we'll see when we get into it that mercantilism is not as crude, perhaps, as some of you may have been led to believe, but nonetheless, there is the underlying notion that a nation grows rich by accumulating gold and silver, or perhaps more generally, the mercantilist view says that we really ought to encourage a, quote, favorable balance of trade. That other things equal, it's good if our people are selling more stuff to foreigners than vice versa. So that's the mercantilist view is, and of course you can see that up to the present day, it's pervasive. And so it was the free trade championing economists, and this I think again is the chief contribution of Adam Smith to blow up that mercantilist worldview and to make the case for free trade. And so we'll be covering that in our treatment of the British classical economists, but also the great laissez-faire French economists of that era. Another topic that we're going to be covering is the subjective versus the labor value theory. All right, so here the distinction is that the classical economists, they had either a cost theory of value or what's actually reduces to a labor theory of value. So here, what does that mean? Well, basically, the way they explained the pattern in the market of the fact that retail prices that consumers paid for products and services, in the long run tended to approximate the so-called cost of production. Right? So if something costs $10 when you're selling, you're selling it to the final consumer, and then you trace back all of the different things that go into that product, including the interest on the invested capital. You add that all up, and it tends to equal about $10 in the long run. And so, why is that? Right. So that's the phenomenon to be explained as economists, and then the question is, how are we going to explain that? And so, a cost or labor theory of value would argue that, well, the price can't deviate, the retail price can't deviate too much in the long run from the cost of production. So given what the cost of productions are what they are, the price of the product, if it were well above that, well then why would that suck new people into the industry, right? If it's this huge gap where the price you were earning from selling something was significantly higher than the cost of producing it, that would attract more people into that, or it would give you the incentive to increase your output if you were already in that industry. And so that couldn't last. On the other hand, if the price were below the cost of production, then you'd be losing money, and so you'd want to cut back, right? So that's sort of the way they would explain it. And then if you pushed it back a step, and you said, okay, well, the prices of the things that went into that final good, right? So if we're talking about a house, and you say, well, the reason the house costs such and such is because you look at the price of the lumber, look at the price of the shingles, look at the price of the bricks, and then you say, okay, but then why is the price of the lumber what it is? And you could, again, decompose that into the things that went into the lumber. And again, you'd use the cost theory of value. So if you use that approach, ultimately you'd see that the one factor that's not, being decomposed into earlier inputs is labor. And so that's like where the explanation would stop at each stage before you would trace it back further with the other physical, non-living inputs. And so that's the sense in which if you start with a generic cost theory of value, you could ultimately boil it down to a labor theory of value. So it ends up being the case, if you take that approach, that it seems the way you're explaining the market price of goods and services at the retail level, at the consumer level, is ultimately by saying, well, there's so much labor power congealed in that stuff. And that's where, that sort of gives rise to the quantitative exchange ratios in the marketplace that we see. And you might recognize that might sound a lot like Marxism, and that's not a coincidence, because in many classification schemes, Karl Marx was simply a classical economist. And obviously he had extreme political views and so on, but in terms of his understanding of the economy, it's not ludicrous to say that Karl Marx in many respects was the heir of Adam Smith. And we'll see that Murray Rothbard actually notes this outcome with some significance, right? So that's what we're going to be studying. That theory is, in my view, utterly untenable, and so we're going to spend a lot of time explaining how the modern, which means post 1870 in this case, subjective theory of value overturned the classical cost theory or labor theory of value. So just very briefly, the subjective value theory looks at that same phenomenon, that why is it that prices for consumer goods in the long run tend to be equal to the prices, the factors of production, and the causality flows the other way. Rather than saying, well, the costs of production are what they are, and then that somehow pins down what the price of the product has to be that they produce, the subjective, what was associated with what's called the marginal revolution approach, goes the other way. And it says, no, the reason certain goods fetch a certain price in the marketplace is because of marginal utility. So, for example, if you're trying to explain the price of a bottle of wine, the new approach does not say, well, the price of the bottle of wine has to be that high because the grapes cost so much, or the land on which the grapes are grown costs such and such, and that's why the price of a bottle of wine has to be at least that amount in order for the producer to break even. That gets things backwards, according to the new approach. The new approach says, no, the reason that bottle of wine has a price is because people like drinking wine. They get utility from it. And then you can go through in terms of supply and demand if you want, or some other approach, to start from that primitive basic fact that people like drinking wine and are willing to give up money for it. And then that's your starting point. And then you say, given now that people are willing to spend money on bottles of wine, according to this schedule of demand, if you will, then that allows us to say, okay, the people who make wine are willing to pay such and such for grapes because they know we can put them into making wine bottles. And then so there's this demand for grapes. And then now the farmers who sell grapes know that there's a certain demand, so they're willing to bid on the use of soil. All right, and so that sort of explains the rental price of an acre of farmland. So you see the causality runs from the ultimate consumer's satisfaction up the chain of production, so that the reason certain land or capital good inputs have a certain price is ultimately explained by the fact that the products they produce provide utility on the margin to consumers. Right? So again, the causality running the opposite direction. So for various reasons, that second approach is much more tenable. If you adopt a cost or labor theory of value approach, there's lots of things you can't even hope to explain, like the price of something you find and you don't know what its origin was. Right? Under a labor or cost theory of value, nobody would know how to value such a thing. If you didn't know what its history was, you didn't know how many labor hours went into it, how could you know how much to sell it for? Right? But with the subjective marginal utility approach, that's child's play to be able to explain that and to explain everything the labor cost theory could explain. So this is an example where there was, in my view, a real definite improvement analogous to Einstein's theory of relativity, both special and general, being more general, if you will, than Newtonian mechanics, right? So the idea was Einstein's new approach could handle all the stuff Newton's theory could, plus a whole lot more. And we'll see that that's a good way of thinking about what happened with the so-called marginal revolution of the early 1870s. So for this particular course, we're going to hit that a lot just to make sure you really understand the progression there. And again, the point's not to say, hey, that's great, the economists made an improvement. The point is for you to understand how modern value theory works. And a great way to illustrate that is to contrast it with the old, now obsolete approach. Okay, and then another major theme we're going to stress in this particular course, this part, is capital and interest theory. So here the giant figure is going to be Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk. He was a sort of second generation Austrian economist that, he had been influenced by Menger, and then in some respects was the teacher of Mises himself. And so Böhm-Bawerk's famous contribution is in capital and interest theory, where he cataloged all the previous theories up till that point, critiqued them all, and then offered his own explanation of why is it that in the marketplace there seems to be this phenomenon called interest, where as long as you have financial capital denominated in money, it seems that generates a return over time almost effortlessly or without inputs from other products, that it just seems like on its own, if you have financial capital, it seems to generate a return, right? And so there has just been so much written on that topic that is fallacious, and Böhm-Bawerk really was a master of categorizing everything, and in his view, critiquing all the previous theories, and then offering his own explanation, which was ultimately based on time preference, to say the reason capitalists earn an income, interest income, is that they're ultimately exchanging present goods for future goods. And so then, since present goods come at a premium, if you're willing to trade present goods for future goods, when you wait for the passage of time and those future goods ripen into present goods, you have more of them than you did previously. And so that's Böhm-Bawerk's explanation in a nutshell of where his interests come from. And viewed in that respect, a lot of the moral objections fall away. That these are just voluntary trades, just like if you traded one banana for two apples, nobody would think that had anything to do with exploitation. They would just say, well, that's preferences, that's the way people value things. And so by the same token, if people exchange one present good for two future goods, that by itself is not evidence of exploitation or anything like that. It's just, well, that's preferences, and that's how things play out in the marketplace. But again, we will get into this looking at various economists, and we're going to spend a lot of time looking at Böhm-Bawerk's critique of other explanations of interest, not so much because it matters what Böhm-Bawerk thought about the naive productivity theory of interest, for example, but rather because of Böhm-Bawerk's rhetorical style and his pedagogical expertise. He would just come up with illustrations and arguments with the goal of blowing up some rival's interest theory, but in the process, you just understand economics so much better after having read that demonstration. And so that's why we're going to spend so much time on it, because I think after you're done with those, not only will you just have newfound respect for this guy Böhm-Bawerk that many of you may not have read before, but you're really going to understand economic theory so much better after reading just the crispness of his thought. Okay, part 2. Again, we're going to cover lots of stuff if you stick with me for that course, but to give you an idea of some of the particular topics besides me just sort of generically calling it 20th century econ. Again, capital and interest, because that's going to be on the front end of the second course installment with Irving Fisher in particular. Then we're going to also cover money, and that might seem odd to you, but just the way these course distribution breaks down, really the kind of monetary theory that I want to teach is not really going to come into play until the second course. We're not really going to have time to cover that so much in the first course. We're also going to spend a lot of time on what's called the socialist calculation debate. Many of you may have heard of that. Here's where Ludwig von Mises was one of the early partisans in this, where he comes along and says not only does socialism not work because of the incentive problem, but even if we stipulate for the sake of argument all of this to the planners, say that they know all the technological transformations available, they have all the technical knowledge, they know how inputs are physically turned into outputs, there's no dispute there, they have all that information from their experts, there's no incentive problem, the comrades are perfectly willing to carry out the orders of the plan or of the planner, follow the plan, and so on. Nonetheless, there's what Mises called a calculation problem. It's not merely one of incentives, it's a problem of calculation. That without having market prices for the means of production, the planner has no way of evaluating, even ex post, was the plan efficient? Did it use resources properly? And so we're going to spend a lot of time with that, reading Mises and Hayek, but also some of the leading socialist theorist responses, just so you can see how that debate unfolded. We're also going to cover some things in game theory. I got my PhD at New York University, and my what they call a field there, sort of like analogous to a major at the undergraduate level. My field there was theory, but by which they meant game theory or microeconomics. So I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what game theory is all about. We'll do some fun stuff. We'll do some fun games and things like the prisoner's dilemma, stuff like that. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, I'll explain to you what Nash equilibrium is. I'll explain to you why that Ron Howard movie was absolutely horrible and completely divorced from the truth. The movie A Beautiful Mind, and we'll seriously, folks, when we get to that one, you're really going to be astonished at how they basically got things exactly backwards. The way they try to use clever, funny scenes with Russell Crowe's characters playing John Nash when he tries to explain, what his insight was in grad school that then would lead him to win the Nobel Prize. It's exactly wrong. It's like I say, if anything, they taught you the opposite of what a Nash equilibrium is in that scene. So we'll tell you the truth here, Liberty Classroom. And we also will, just to either entice you or make you get intimidated, on one of the lectures in part 2, we will cover Arrow's impossibility theorem. And I think I'll give like a two-tiered lecture there so you can tune into the one that you want. But I will do a sort of just introduction, explain it in plain English, and then we'll give a supplemental lecture that, again, is optional for those of you who don't want to get into it, where I'll literally prove it mathematically, formally. And the reason I'm going to do that is Arrow's theorem is very powerful. It's very counterintuitive. When I explain to you what he showed, you're not going to believe me. Because what he did, in case you're not familiar with it, is Arrow made some postulates about ideal systems that would go from individual preferences to a social preference ranking, right? So looking at various states of the world, and each citizen has his or her own subjective ranking from best to worst of how he or she would want the world outcome to occur. And then we want to say, is there some kind of function, some systematic way that we can take any possible set of citizen rankings and then merge them or amalgamate them into one so-called social ranking? And so Arrow just gave some very modest proposals for, well, surely if every single person in society likes A more than B, it better not be the case that the social welfare ranking says B is better than A. That would just be crazy, right? So making modest claims like that. And then Arrow showed that he had just eliminated all possible social welfare functions, that there is no way to construct a mechanism to map from the individual subjective rankings to a, quote, social one without violating one of these rules that seemed at first to be quite straightforward and shouldn't be controversial, right? So if you're not a fan of democracy, or more generally, if you're very suspicious of political institutions, you're going to love the result. It's very refreshing in that respect. It'll probably line up with your prior expectations. But even though it's very powerful and counterintuitive, there's a neat way to prove it, right? That doesn't involve too much. And so if you're just willing to give me some time, let me define some terminology for you, I'll walk you step by step through it, and you can see what it means when mainstream economists say they proved something, right? So that's another reason I want to show it to you, is to just show this is what it means to do something formally with symbols, and just so you have an idea, so you can see an example of a famous result from mainstream economics that we can actually prove without you need to take a course in math. And then the other main theme from that course is going to be the role of expectations. And so we're going to be covering the Lucas critique. You may have heard of that famous demonstration where Lucas showed that the Keynesian orthodoxy of the 50s and 60s rested on this serious problem where they assumed people in the economy acted a certain way, and that if policymakers tried to take advantage of those relationships, that the people wouldn't react and act differently. All right, and so one example of this would be the so-called Phillips curve, that if you thought there was this trade-off between inflation and unemployment, by which they mean price inflation, you couldn't just say, oh, so now if the central bank just prints more money, that will, cause price inflation, but at least they'll get rid of unemployment, right? Well, no, once the labor unions adjust to the new reality, they'll just increase their wage demands even more. And so the Phillips curve would move, if that's the way you want to think about it. But the point being the Lucas critique saying that you have to take into account people's understanding of the system at work, and then a lot of what you do in an economy is based on your expectations of the future. And so if you impose a static model of behavior and assume people aren't changing their forecast of what's going to happen in the future, you can get some pretty absurd results. And then we're also going to be using this idea of expectations when it comes to evaluating the so-called market monetarists. That there are people nowadays who say the Fed has been too tight, and their approach relies very heavily on the Chicago School understanding of incentives and expectations. And so I want to spend some time on them, because I think a lot of modern day Austrians need to be more familiar with these other schools, if for no other reason than to interact with them and to be able to critique them. You need to know what they're talking about. Okay, so in this course, I'm going to be relying on giants in the history of economic thought. All right, so what do I mean by that? Giants versus textbooks. What I'm saying here is I would rather give you sort of a narrative of what a few key thinkers thought on these various topics, rather than a sort of textbook history of economic thought approach where it sort of neutrally summarizes the various things that this thinker said and so on down the line. I think it's more important, or it's better in this context, if you just pick a few key people and rely on them as your guides through the history. And so in particular, let me list the ones that I'm going to be relying on, just so you know my biases. And if you want to go read these yourself, you'll know where I'm getting a lot of the information for the course lectures. So the one I'm relying on most heavily is going to be Murray Rothbard, who ended up at UNLV, Lionel Robbins, the London School of Economics, Joseph Schumpeter from Harvard, and Jacob Wiener of Chicago, and Mark Blogg, University of Buckingham. I'm not going to be relying on him so much for this course, but if you are getting into the history of economic thought, I'm just saying he's a big name in more recent times. Right? So these are some of, Rothbard, obviously I'm including him because of my affinity for the Austrian school. I know a lot of people who are Liberty Classroom members are going to be fans of Murray Rothbard, and he, here as with most other places, just has done an unbelievable amount of research. And so you're just reading his book, you're seeing all sorts of interesting things that you hadn't read elsewhere. But these other names are recognized in mainstream circles as being giants in the history of economic thought, right? So I'm not just randomly picking these other guys. So I'm relying most heavily, just so you're aware, on Rothbard and Lionel Robbins, that for any given topic I cover, I'm going to read their treatment pretty thoroughly, and to a lesser extent, the other people on this slide. Okay, so this leads to the question, why should we study the history of economic thought? You've explained what you're going to do, Murphy, but what's the point? Why should I bother studying this course? Well, I think part of it is just this idea of roots and branches, right? So to understand the cutting edge research, you really need to know the history of the field, even in something like physics, all right? And going along with this, the Whig theory of history is wrong, even in physics, right? So what do we mean by the Whig theory of history? That's the idea that whatever there was in the past that was useful and correct would have been retained. And then, so if you want to study something, you need to just look at what the latest textbook says. Why would you bother going back and studying something, from the past? And so, again, even in physics, this is not correct. And that's what I'm saying. If you look at Kuhn or Feyerabend, you'll see in their treatments they have classic works in the philosophy of science, and they show that this model you probably learned about how a scientist makes a hypothesis and then goes and collects data and then compares it to the hypothesis, and then if the data fit better, well, then they overturn the old theories and adopt the new one, right? And that's how science progresses, and that's why at any given moment the best scientific theory is the one that scientists currently believe in. And that's a very naive story. That's not actually what happened in the history even of physics and chemistry, which are, quote, hard sciences. And so if it's not even true there, and so it makes sense there that you would want to know the history of the field, right? That it's true. You don't spend too much time really studying the system of Ptolemy, but you do, if you want to study physics and astronomy, probably have a basic understanding of Copernicus and Kepler, and you understand Newton's theories. You don't just dive right into quantum mechanics. You first study classical physics, classical mechanics. And that's natural. That's what you do even in something like physics, a hard science. So clearly in economics, it makes sense that you would study classical economics if you really wanted to understand what happened then in the 20th century and beyond. Okay, but there's more than that. So here I'm calling this slide social versus the natural sciences. Let me just motivate this by saying to you, stop for a minute. In what fields do you think that wrong turns can happen? Right? So I'm thinking about psychology, psychiatry, sociology, in fields like that where you get the idea that all the smart people who are cranking out material in those fields, it wouldn't shock you if someone claimed that field had taken a wrong turn in 1930 or in 1940. So like with psychology, I mean, a lot of people recognize in psychiatry that the impact of Freud was largely a negative one, and certain trends in sociology, I've seen backlashes and things people think that, oh, wait a minute, this was just this notion that crept in at this point and mushroomed. That's really putting us on the wrong track here. Okay. And so we see those things happening, and clearly in economics, regardless of your ideological perspective, you can think the wrong turn happens. So clearly people who believe in the free market, laissez-faire, they look upon Keynesianism, that so-called revolution, with disdain. They think that was a huge wrong turn. But by the same token, Paul Krugman also thinks that right now we're suffering in what he calls a dark age of economics, right? He thinks that a lot of the lessons that had been learned during the 1930s are now being are being forgotten. That a lot of the fallacies that he thought were exploded back then are now being reintroduced, right? So there is this idea that these wrong turns occur. But yet, you don't see that phenomenon so much in the so-called hard sciences, right? There's not, I mean, there is to some extent in terms of people who believe in string theory and people who don't, and physics and so on. But it's not, you don't get the sense that there's a school of thought in physics the way in economics, for example. There's the Austrian school, the Keynesian school, the Chicago school, right? That there could be flavors of that in physics, but it's not nearly as well developed. And you would never, well, not never, but you'd rarely hear somebody say, yeah, physics was making so much more sense, and then that guy Heisenberg should have ruined everything. The way you might imagine a professional psychologist saying, yeah, my field was great until Freud came on the scene and ruined everything. Okay, and so the question is, why is that? What explains this phenomenon? And then once we understand this, we can see why studying the history of thought is even more important when it comes to social sciences, and in particular economics, than it would be in physics, right? It's really probably actually not going to be that harmful if most people getting PhDs in physics don't spend too much time studying the history of their field, and they can focus more on the cutting edge theories and what are the current disputes and so on. The real sharp ones, of course, will take a long term view and they'll just be well read, but it's actually probably not that harmful if they don't really know much about the field. But in economics, it's really harmful if people have no idea of what the past controversies were and they don't realize that the new models they're using may have been due to one particular faction winning a debate in terms of numbers, at least, if not in terms of truth, a generation before them. And they just assume that, oh, yeah, this must be done this way because it works and it's correct, when no, maybe that's not really what happened. Maybe we should go back and look at those old controversies. Maybe the group that people thought lost actually was correct. Okay, so what is it that explains this? How can there be this contrast? Well, very briefly, it's because, in my view, the correct method to be used in the social sciences is different from that in the natural sciences. And in particular, in the natural sciences, we don't really care about motivations. All we care about is prediction. That's the ultimate criterion for success. Like when they say, yeah, quantum physics is crazy, it makes no sense, but it works, and that's why we use those models. It's because they can predict, what the scatter plot of light on a sheet's going to look like with it in the two-slit experiment, if you're familiar with that from physics. And so, or you can have those particle accelerators, and they can predict with fine precision what those instrument readings are going to be, even though the models involve things that defy normal human comprehension. In contrast, in the social sciences, you're never going to get such accuracy in prediction. There's too much going on. There's too many variable factors. If you want to engage in a cliche, humans are unpredictable. And so you're fooling yourself if you try to make the social sciences look just like the natural sciences, that there's a huge chasm in between them. But what is different is in the social sciences, we have some advantages that we ourselves are thinking beings. We ourselves use reason. And so we know what it's like to be one of the things in these models or explanations, whereas we really don't know what it's like to be an electron. That doesn't really even make any sense. And so in the natural sciences, all we can really do is focus on the outcome, the external observations, whereas in the social sciences, we can engage in introspection. We know what it's like to be in the mind of these acting beings. All right, so we're going to cover this stuff obviously in much greater detail when we cover the thinkers involved and talk about some of these methodological disputes. But I just want to point that out to you at this early stage. There is this huge chasm between the social and natural sciences. And so I think that sheds light on why is studying the history of thought so much more important in the social than the natural sciences. It's related to this distinction right here, that in the social sciences, and in particular in economics, I'm a fan of the methodology of Ludwig von Mises, who said you start with the axiom that humans act, and you deduce things logically from there. And that's how you build up the core of economic theory, and then you use that to interpret historical events. And so if you're going to argue economics with someone, you're really ultimately arguing on a theoretical level. So if that's the issue, then you can see why that's never going to be settled through empirical observation. Whereas in something like physics or chemistry or astronomy, even, um, ultimately you can settle things because really what you're using to judge a theory is how well does it predict. But again, in the social sciences, nothing's going to be able to predict in that sense. And so you're ultimately falling back on other criteria to evaluate it. And so rather than fooling yourself about what you're doing, if you're up front about it, then you'll see why these doctrinal disputes actually take on much more relevance when it comes to social sciences. And so that's why we really ought to go back and revisit those controversies to make sure we're not losing anything important. And so that, I think, sums up what we're going to be doing in this course. I'm very excited to present this material to you, and I hope you will enjoy the ride as well. Looking forward to it, everyone.